Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
As soon as the guy woke up, he immediately realized that he was back in his dream, which he had been seeing for days on end. This was the dream he already knew by heart. An Exile girl appeared before him, and she beat her chest so hard that even bruises protruded on her snow-white skin. She was dressed in a beautiful outfit with traditional Yogyakarta patterns. However, he had never yet heard of an Exile descendant becoming part of the royal family of Yogyakarta. But after some thought, the boy realized that it had happened once, but that time it had been a man, not a woman. He stood up and walked closer to the mysterious girl. He noticed that she was not wearing a garment that a person who was not preparing to meet death would not wear. He touched her face and started to move her hair away from her eyes. When he saw how afraid she was of him, he said in a quiet voice that it was okay. She shouldn't worry. But then, suddenly, she looked up at him and smiled and called him baby. The boy looked down and saw that there was a huge bruise on her chest because of how hard she had hit it. When she noticed his gaze, she immediately wondered where he was looking so intently. But the guy was not ashamed of it and did not even look away. He turned to the girl and asked her not to hold back any longer. The stranger looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. And he moved closer and wondered if she hadn't heard that if you suppress rage, one day it just might consume you completely. The girl laughed and said that he was very adorable. However, she called him a child at that moment. The girl also added that she always thought she was right and was absolutely sure of her actions no matter what she did. However, the truth ended up being quite different. She just didn't know what she was doing, so now she doesn't even know how to be in such a situation. The boy looked at her with his big blue eyes and replied in a worried voice that he wasn't quite sure what she was even talking about. Then suddenly, she ran her hand across his cheek, and afterward, kissing his forehead, she said that he would understand later. Everything around him started to become brighter, and with a smile, the girl also added that he would find out about everything. However, it would have to wait for a while. The guy didn't realize what was going on, but she started tugging on his cheek at that moment. It was not very pleasant for him, and soon he woke up. As soon as he opened his eyes, he realized he was in his room. The man was absolutely covered in sweat and was breathing heavily because he was once again having this strange dream that he had never understood. This dream had eaten right into his soul, a dream that one could never get used to, no matter how many times it was dreamed in a row. At this very time, a large fortress was being guarded by guards. They went around with guns to check that everything was in order and that no one had gotten in. But then suddenly, some girl approached him. She asked him if she had to kill everyone to get him to pay attention to her. This girl was talking about him coming over at last. She was also annoyed that he was pretending as if he couldn't hear. The man, sighing heavily, looked in her direction and asked what she wanted. The girl immediately asked him to come closer and scratch her head. Smiling, she said she wouldn't bite. It was just that her hands were tied tightly and she couldn't move in any way. This girl was the second child of the Dew family, Adrian Dew. When the man apologized, he said that they were strictly forbidden to touch the prisoners. He also added that she was well aware of that, so he didn't understand what she was hoping for. And besides, she hadn't washed her hair for a long time, and he just hated it. Adrian then said that they all acted like that because they were from the capital. She then turned in the other direction and turned to a guy named Nahil, asking him to come over too. The man didn't like it very much, but he came closer. The girl pointed her finger at him and told him to look. This guy's head was dirty too. The guard, very indignant, wondered what she was even proud of. He didn't understand how commanders and subordinates could be so dirty, and added that they must be very lucky to have met each other at all. Adrian sighed heavily and said he was just a fool, because it wasn't lice or bugs, but burned skin. And she started calling him names, because he didn't want to help them. She wondered if he had ever been among the foliage of the plains of the east, where the savages dwell. There one cannot find even the slightest space in the shade. And when one finds oneself among the white stony plains between which most of the savages hide, Their radiance is simply dazzling. And by the time all the savages, though with difficulty, were decapitated and could be retreated, the scalp was so burned that the skin would have to peel off for the next 3 days. And now, hardly has the skin had time to renew itself before a new horde still full of strength appears and must be fought. Adrian said there were few who could even endure such a thing, except for especially strong-minded people. Then he inquired in a trembling voice why she had sent slave soldiers there. The girl, with a smile on her face, wondered if he really wanted to know. The man looked away from her and replied that he only wanted to fulfill his duties, albeit a little late. Adrian was a little upset about this, for she had hoped that at least a little fun would show up, and said that in that case she was still asking for him to scratch her head. The guard, hearing this, became indignant and asked why a guard should be scratching the heads of prisoners. The girl said that judging by the fact that he had come without a whip and was talking to her, he even liked her, and her head itched incredibly, and Adrian wouldn't mind having a bath at last. When he saw how furious she was, he offered to scratch her with a spade, wondering if that would suit her. She wondered in a trembling voice if he wanted to slit her throat under the pretense and dedicate the deed to the first princess. Adrian also asked how much he was even paid for it, but at that point he started to stick a stick through there, but didn't have time to do it because another man came up to them. This unknown person was the eldest child of the Dew family, Kaylee Dew, and, turning to Adrian, he said that she was still the same. The man, of course, didn't believe her when she talked about her itchy head, and also added that he was 4 years older than her and didn't understand how she could be so careless as to call her brother just by his first name. He drew his sword and thrust it through the bars, bringing it closer to the girl's throat, saying that he might have to scratch her head until it bled. But the girl laughed and told him to stop threatening her like that, because he couldn't do anything with that toothpick, which he didn't even know how to use. The man began to bring that sword closer and closer to her throat, and with a smile on his face asked if she thought he could just chop her head off in 1 second. But the girl was contentedly brave, so she told him to only be careful not to drop the sword carelessly, or else he might injure himself. The girl had a completely battered face, and she said that he could apparently be without a leg much faster than she could be without a head. The girl disliked her brother as much as he disliked her. Kaylee had already stopped smiling and turned to his sister and said that he had heard that she had brought only slaves with her from the White Rocky Plains. So he inquired as to what she needed the brat that was near the girl for. He was referring to Nahil, who was completely imprisoned in wooden fetters so that there was no possibility of escape. Adrian looked at him in surprise and said that she didn't understand why he was asking such stupid questions, since he was already a slave. She also asked him to keep in mind that he could break his other leg if he jumped from side to side with his sword. He immediately remembered how many rumors had been going around him. People were always hurting him because he had broken his leg. They said that he would hobble his whole life and would never be the same. Then, unable to stand it, he slapped the girl across the face and asked what a lowlife like her, who just sits behind bars and gets smart, can do to him. Adrian, smiling, told him to turn on his brains and think for a moment. Certainly with her own hands, she wouldn't be able to get him. She wondered, however, if he thought the Prince of Eton would leave him alone at all. At this point, the man had already entered her cage and asked if she had tried it herself. If this prince of hers cared about her very much, he probably wouldn't have left her to rot alone in that cage. He then grabbed her by the throat, and Adrian wondered why her prince would even care about her. He started choking his sister. Then he threw her to the ground, and the girl said that His Highness Ethan had only himself to think of, and she'd been wrong to leave her in this place so she couldn't interfere with his serious plans. Well, if someone hurt his right arm, that was a whole different matter. And she wondered if he agreed that in that case, he would have every reason to retaliate. The man looked at her warily, and afterward said it was impossible for him to know whether he even needed this right-hand man who couldn't even stand up for himself. He said she had tried to turn a key principle of this country upside down, and it didn't matter at all if it was all about winning the war. His Majesty still wouldn't let her get away with it that easily. Adrian, upon hearing this, was silent for a while, and after that, she said that it could be said as well. However, if His Majesty was going to show his rod, he should have done it much earlier. She said that it was the right thing to do because she had won the victory, so she did not understand why he was doing this to her. Her brother replied that it was her personal military affairs, and he was not going to participate in all these silly and useless dialogues for a long time. The girl suddenly laughed and said that he was the ultimate bastard. It was precisely because this was a military matter that he should discuss it as long as possible. She looked at him with a smile and wondered if it was really that much trouble for him. Kaylee suddenly turned away from her and called her a crazy idiot, not realizing how she even dared to say such a thing. The girl in a playful voice immediately started apologizing and asked if he was so offended because she called him a wretch. She also said that it just came out of her mouth by accident. She also said that she did not think it was necessary to take offense at it, because on the battlefield they always called each other that. Then he hit her hard again, and the girl, throwing her hands up in the air, said that this time she had hurt her own leg. The doctors even said it might not fully recover, so she wondered if they were even now, since he could call her a wretch in return. Then Kaylee was too angry to stay in that place and continue to argue with his sister, so when he got out, he slammed the bars behind him and said he wanted to watch this Ethan guy rescue the idiot with the mangled leg, who was now completely useless even as a knight. He left her alone to ponder what he had just said. The girl sat at the edge of the bars, staring off into the distance. In fact, Adrian Dew was the second child of the Dew family, and she was known to people in completely different guises. For example, she was like Lady Dew or just Adrian. However, she had another notorious nickname. Many people called her the second prince's rabid dog. For the noble and ancient Dew family, it was a shock to be addressed as a daughter. Only shocking for everyone was also the breakup of this very family. In the end, even brother and sister found themselves on different sides of the barricades when they favored different heirs. Barbate was the head of the Dew family. He answered then that he did not know, and said that they could do what they wanted, for he did not care about it anymore. Exile is a kingdom that is rich in black water that ignites fire, and it has been in a state of struggle for the throne for 5 years. The first princess, named Della, received patronage from the temple, and she was called Saint Exile. It was her bravery that pierced the heavens. Della became the heroine who defeated the enemies in the north and thus strengthened her position in society. After this event, the savvy Kaylee Dew took the side of the second princess. But as for the second prince Ethan himself, who opposed his sister, although he was weak in health, he was still able to enrich the kingdom by taking advantage of his very flexible and deep mind. Being only a 15-year-old teenager, he was able to find a more useful use for the black water that started fires in the military. However, at a reception in honor of his 20th birthday, the first princess razed her brother to death, saying that the inventor could never be king. Some have speculated that the first princess to receive patronage from the temple is a more likely candidate to be the next monarch. However, things eventually changed when Adrian Dew, who had just been given a razor title and had turned against the princess, sided with the second prince. Having triumphed under the flag of the second prince, she presented the king of Exile with the head of King Brish and proceeded to carry victory after victory, giving all honors to her favorite. So much Adrian Dew was brave, how much she was also blind, doing whatever Prince Ethan asked her to do. The nickname of being the rabid dog of the second prince stuck to her right after she executed a follower of the first princess right in front of the royal court for insulting her prince. This behavior of Adrian's got on the nerves of the first princess and Kaylee, and in retaliation she was thrown into war in the White Rocky Plains where the kingdom's most troublesome enemy, namely the savages, resided. Even with all the hardships she had to endure, she invariably came back victorious, even from there. Except that when she passed through the capital's gates, it wasn't flowers that flew in her direction. Poor Adrian was tied up as soon as she arrived back in the kingdom. Soon the girl was summoned to the estate of the princess, and the second prince. He turned to his aide and said that he would see to it that she spent all her time in prison in peace. So when he saw her in person, he asked what was wrong with her condition. The aide said that the princess may have had a hand in it, but to be more accurate, it was Callie Dew who did it, not the princess. That these brother and sister hate each other more than anything else in the world is a pretty widely known truth, and the princess probably wouldn't risk her reputation by personally wanting to deal with this girl. Then the aide inquired whether everything was as before. With His Majesty, the prince replied that everything was perfectly correct. However, he heard that his sister had also failed to meet him. So the aide, upon hearing this, summarized it by saying that meant they only had half a chance, but it was better than nothing. Soon the doors to the room opened, and then a rather elderly but very handsomely dressed man walked in. The guards who were around immediately saluted His Majesty, and Adrian looked in his direction without saying a word. This man was the king of Exile, and addressing all the people who had gathered in the hall at that moment, he asked that they stop discussing already. He then turned to Adrian and called her the second child of the Dew family, and a proud woman and knight of Exile. The man said in a tired but contentedly wise voice that she should have been in the banquet hall. Unfortunately, however, that was not possible. The girl bowed and said that she was still very grateful to him. When the people heard the king's words, they immediately began to whisper. They could not believe that he had really called her a knight and not a criminal. In fact, it was no secret that the mistress of the Dewa family had been denied a visa. Ethan even suggested that the king had given up on Adrian, since she'd been restricted from the rights that even criminals have. Then the king turned to the girl again and inquired if she herself knew why she stood in this place under the rank of an outlaw. The girl replied in a quiet voice that of course she knew everything. Then the man asked her to tell him why she had to be in this position. Adrian looked at him and said that she had used the Ilang slaves as soldiers, after which she had the indiscretion to promise that those of them who proved worthy would be released. In fact, this is what violated the values of the heavenly god Achiller and the principle of caste system of the state. And all because the people of Ilanka could never be equal to the people of Exile, so the actions and words she said were simply unacceptable. Ethan's aide suddenly spoke. He addressed His Highness, saying that Lady Adrian, going to the Rocky Plains, received only 2,000 soldiers under her leadership. However, she only managed 500 slave soldiers, because the other 150,000 remained in the camp on the orders of the commander. That's why their plan failed. He explained that it is quite impossible to win a battle in the usual way when only a third of the squad is available, and even that is not properly prepared for battle. The king looked at this aide and said that Adrian Dew's act violated the orders of this country as well as the teachings of the Temple of Achille. And he also said that it was only his prerogative to reward slave soldiers for their labors, so she had no right to speak out in such a manner. The girl looked up at that moment and saw that the princess and her brother were standing there. He smiled smugly and looked around. In fact, back when she'd been getting punished too, Kaylee had behaved exactly the same way. She smiled back at him as their gazes met and couldn't believe that absolutely nothing was changing. Then the king said that according to the precepts of Achille and Lactia, they were inherently inferior to the citizens of Exile, and those who would treat them as equals rather than slaves should be executed. However, a knight of the Dew family had won a victory worthy of her name from the first battle in a far-off land, and so far she had consistently proved loyal to her state. Therefore, he said, it was quite impossible to disregard her services in defeating the savages from the White Rocky Plains who threatened the safety of their empire. So the man turned to the chancellor and inquired as to what they should do with Adrian Dew after all. At this moment, Della spoke, and apologizing to His Highness, said that the chancellor was the father of this very criminal, and in this case was not a good candidate. But at this point, the king turned to her and said that he hadn't actually given her the floor, so he wanted to hear the chancellor after all. Thoth, bowing, said that although Adrian Dew was of her lineage, he had no intention of excusing her crime. The man said that still the savages from the rocky plains had not yet been completely subdued, which was what made him uneasy. So he dared to say that the kingdom was in desperate need of a distinguished knight, which means it would be a waste to send such a talent to the scaffold. So he asked the king how he felt about sending this power to a place where it could be fully utilized. The man looked at him in surprise and immediately inquired as to what this place was all about, and the chancellor replied that there were several options to consider for the situation. The first of these was to change her into the clothes of an ordinary knight, forcing her to go all the way from the beginning. She must forfeit her personal glory, but in this way she will be able to raise the spirits of her co-workers. The second way was to send her to find the culprit March. However, he had escaped more than 10 years ago, taking the holy relics, so his search would bear little fruit. And the last option was to send her to the regency in Yogyakarta, which had been conquered the previous year. The climate there is quite hot and humid, so no one would want to be a regent in that region. So he thinks that she can be sent as a temporary replacement to the Tadaburo clan. The king, hearing this, immediately thought about it, and then said that there was nothing to choose from. The search for Marth was definitely off the list. Then he turned to the head of Acella's order, namely Alphen, and inquired about the pros and cons of demoting Adrian Dew to a common soldier. The man bowed and said he was already encouraged by the fact that they could count on her co-workers' improved skills. However, he still felt it was best not to do so, as discipline in the squad would seriously suffer after such a thing. Ethan, at this point, scratched his head and started giggling. He was even wondering if there was a person who didn't know how much of a headache Adrian had given everyone. He always told her not to do anything stupid, and she ended up becoming a criminal. Then the king, suddenly tapping his seat, said he had to think about what decision to make. And afterward she turned to Adriano, saying that he was ordering her to go south. When the girl heard this, she wondered in surprise. Did he really mean that she should go into exile in Yogyakarta? Was this a big shock to her as well as Ethan? However, here was the princess very happy to hear such news. In fact, Ocello was the largest kingdom for several centuries. After the wise king ascended the throne, many tribes became colonies of the kingdom. The heavenly god dogma was the official ideology, but people whispered, believing that it was only created to proclaim a ruler. However, no one knew for sure. As for Yogyakarta directly, it was the home of the black water that kindles fire, just like Ocello, as well as the kingdom of the 13 clans. Above all, it was a country that possessed the black water so coveted by Ocella. The northern and central parts of the teeming continent were inhabited by the white-skinned Assyrians, while the southern lands, where the sun hungrily blazes, were settled by the swarthy natives of the immediate country. And among all those clans, Viral had a specialty, namely wings. It was popularly believed that such an image was detrimental to the divine status of the Ophalara. So it was this clan in Ocello that was recognized as most desiring total extermination. The present king, having barely ascended the throne, was the first ruler to attempt to conquer this country. And after many years of kingship, Ocella succeeded in this intention. And eventually the girl was exiled to the very place she had never been to before, but about which there were many different rumors. King said she should go there as deputy regent and help his protege Celestis ascend to the throne. The man also said that once appointed, she will take the position of adjutant for the next 5 years for the sake of ensuring full control of Yogyakarta. And only then will he forget the sins that were committed by the Knight of the Dew family, and she will be able to return back after atoning for her sins. In reality, Celeste Lu was the person the king had personally chosen as his heir. After he took the past Princess Elmara hostage, that's when it happened. And after all that, he ordered to introduce Prince Celeste as a legend from the kingdom of Ocella. But in the end, he appointed the girl not regent but deputy regent, which is like taking Assisi. If even for the war with Yogyakarta, it was necessary to recruit soldiers from other states. It was that country of the southern savages, the hot climate had seriously injured the health of the present deputy regent of Tatterbury, and the people were well aware of it. But given all the merits of the Dew family and Adrian's own merits, she can't even get the credentials she deserves in the end. She's been made some sort of aide. Thoth turned suddenly to Prince Ethan's aide, and after apologizing to His Highness, inquired when, in that case, she would be appointed official regent. At that moment, the girl immediately realized what the matter was, and the people, when they heard the question, immediately began to whisper. But the king replied that he had not yet decided when it would happen. Ethan, when he heard all this, was very angry and realized that if she was not appointed regent but only deputy, she would not be able to return eventually. Della, when she heard this, immediately started giggling. She realized that if this girl was just thrown out like this, her brother would have to fight for the throne without a right hand. The aide turned to His Highness again and said that Adrian Dew's sin was very great, for she had thrown aside the will of the heavenly God and promised freedom to soldiers and slaves. However, one of her sins had become a feat at the same time, so he asked that the man outline the scope of her punishment. The king, when he heard this, immediately hesitated, and afterwards said that, since the count himself said so, he would give Adrian the way for an indulgence. He probably didn't know what he should do, so he thought about it for a while. And Adrian, hearing all this, felt a strong disgust. The count's attempt to protect her made her want to vomit, for His Highness could not tolerate such tricks. The reason why Bombardoo held the chancellor's seat for 20 years was his ability to read His Highness's mind. And that was why the king's thinking was also obvious to Adrian, his daughter. However, by no means Earl rises, so she was certainly grateful for his help and support, but it did not help her at all. And then, to the girl's surprise, the king said that many people say that there is a golden city somewhere in Yogyakarta, so he said that the girl must find it. When Ethan heard this, he was very surprised, for he thought the golden city was just a legend. So with that, the king simply tells her to end her life in that place. But the king said that if she really did it, it would constitute the greatest feat that would bring glory to their state. When Della heard this, she began to laugh even more. After all, it was really a treasure trove of simple fairy tales. The king said that denying Athalar was a serious sin, so she must do something to prove the Lord's influence, even in the barbarian land. He said that if she could pull it off, he would forgive her crimes and promise her the laurels of a commander of a knighthood. When the girl heard this, she immediately realized that if she could accomplish all of this, she would be promoted. And looking straight at the king, she thought about how he was incredibly fond of playing to the audience after all. The man said that 2 people were going on this expedition. Then Ethan, unable to stand it, began to shout, saying that all this was unthinkable and that this was not the right thing to do. But the king, looking at him sternly, said that he did not allow him to say that. Without pausing, he added that 2 men were as good as Exile. The man understood this perfectly well. Although the king had indeed covered it up as a so-called mission, it was in fact a simple exile. But the king turned to all present and told them to provide Adrian Dew with 1 warrior. He also said that in view of the special contribution of Locke soldiers and slaves to the victory on the White Rocky Plains, he suggested that some of them should go with her. In fact, the girl was not very happy about it, because the people of Yogyakarta are angry and hostile to the kingdom of Exile, which is engaged in a protracted war. Yes, and besides, the dogma of Athalar teaches them to grovel before the natives of this land. Obviously, even with a trained warrior accompanying her, it would be very difficult for the girl to be there. Ethan, unable to stand it, started screaming again, telling His Highness that this was simply unthinkable. When the king was about to answer him something, Della suddenly turned to her brother and said with a sinister smile on her face that no one had given him a word at all. The guy already wanted to attack his sister because she was so annoying to him, but the count managed to stop him in time. The girl, still giggling, told Ethan that if he opened his mouth again, he would be kicked out of the hall and also said that the girl should thank His Highness with all her soul for undertaking something like this. But even with just one traveling companion, she wouldn't be bored anymore, so she didn't see it as a problem, nor did she see the need to send an entire guard there. At that moment, Adrian looked at the servant next to her and thought about the fact that if he didn't go, surely the others certainly wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the king rose and said that the soldier slave who had taken the most active part in the Adrian do treason, for which, though deserving of the death penalty, he thought he ought to be branded. He asked that the tongue of the slave who swung his sword and dared to seek change be branded, so that in the future, until his last breath, he would not be able to forget his essence. And at that moment, the two of them were immediately escorted out of the hall. Poor Nigel was seized by two guards to carry out the king's will. The girl looked at him and then reached out and began to wipe his burned skin and apologized for all that he had been through. Also smiling, she said that they would meet very soon, and after that, the guards immediately led away this man, who still tried to resist for a while, but soon realized that it was useless. Adrian, who remained standing, sighed heavily and said that she too should have hit that jailer on the head when she was still in the dungeon. Seeing the man flee as quickly as possible from the hall, she wondered if he was so afraid because of her promise to slit his throat. And also smiling, she asked what it would be like if she could do it right in the throne room. The girl thought it would look quite spectacular. But at that moment, Ethan suddenly came up to them and, turning to one of the guards, asked if he could give them a moment to talk. The one, bowing, said that of course he could do it. However, he said that they would only have a minute, after which he stepped aside. At this moment, they were also approached by Gora, who had been talking to His Highness the whole time, and immediately began to plug his nose, for the girl stank very badly. Upon seeing this, Adrian became indignant and said that when he defended her, he was pretending as if everything was fine. Count Risa indignantly said that of course he couldn't plug his nose while standing right in front of His Highness, so he had to endure. But turning to him, he told him to stop already. The boy, sighing heavily, immediately apologized and said that it would not happen again. Adrian, still smiling, said that she had received an apology from Count Risa, which was why she thought the sun would rise in the west that day. The Count was very indignant when she said this, for he was actually a very good and decent man, so he didn't understand why she was exaggerating everything so much. Adrian interrupted him and said she didn't need him to be sorry, and if he was really sorry, he'd better get some pretty boy on her way. When the man heard this, he was immediately disgusted, and he said that he no longer regretted anything at all. After that, the girl shifted her gaze to Ethan, who was standing next to her. The one bowed and immediately greeted her, but said nothing more, so they stood in silence for a while. The girl broke their awkward silence and said it wasn't the first time she'd been there, so she'd be back before she knew it. Until then, she asked that he take care of his health and not eat or drink everything he was given, for he must not forget those poison cookies he had eaten while she was away last time on the battlefield. Ethan scratched the back of his head nervously and said that he'd talked about seeing her eat them herself several times before, hadn't he? Adrian at this point suddenly started beating her chest and said that she had also told him more than once that while living the life of a vagrant, she could eat anything, whether it was poison or something worse. So she said, smiling, that she was sure she'd be fine in her new place and that she'd be able to fend for herself in case of trouble. So she didn't think he needed to worry so much. Ethan didn't say anything to that. He just put his head down and thought about the fact that even though she was saying it with complete certainty, he wasn't sure if it was true at all. In order to diffuse the tension, he told her not to eat anything off the ground. Adrian, with a smile on his face, wondered if that was all he wanted to say to his best subordinate before the journey. The man said he was being completely serious, and when she heard that, she wanted to take his hand as a sign of farewell. But then she suddenly realized that her hands were very dirty, so she immediately put it away. But then suddenly Ethan grabbed her hand and took it in his. He looked at her with a smile for a while. Adrian was very surprised, but then told His Highness that her hands were very dirty, so he had better not touch her. But the man, laughing, said that if he had really cared about such a thing, he would have kicked her out as a 12-year-old girl. He said that she was then roasting meat in the garden of his palace, picking her teeth with a branch. Adrian said reflectively that if he had really done that before, he would now be living in absolute tranquility. But the man, looking at her in surprise, asked, "Does she really think he could do that?" Then suddenly the voice of the Count whispered in her ear, saying that he had personally begged him to do so. However, even that failed to sway his decision, and because of that, he felt very sorry. Ethan suddenly leaned closer to the girl, said that saying something like that in this situation was a little strange. However, he said, the seat next to him was still empty. Adrian, hearing this, looked at him for a while. Afterward, pretending to be disgusted by it, she told him to stop saying such things. Ethan was surprised, but he should have expected it, and with a smile on his face, he wondered what other lady would have responded to the prince's proposal with such an expression on her face. Then the girl looked at him and wondered what would happen if she agreed right now. The man replied that she would be a princess who had accepted a proposal in the hall of the Ophiolarians and yet still had the status of a sinner. Adrian immediately turned toward Count Risa and wondered if he would remind her of her nickname. Did she know correctly that she was called the second prince's rabid dog? The man said nothing, but lowered his head, pretending not to listen to her. And she continued talking, saying that she knew that there was another nickname that was more offensive. In fact, it had been over a decade since the women of Ocella had been allowed to become knights, but even so, female knights were still labeled with that horrible label. They were called ball courtesans, which was why the Count immediately reminded her of the nickname she was called all the time. The girl wondered, surprised, if there wasn't a more hurtful word in there. Then the man asked in a quiet voice if she really wanted him to say such a word in front of Afalar himself. Adrian immediately turned towards Ethan and said that it was indeed true, but be that as it may, if His Highness appointed her as princess, she would only suffer damage. Then suddenly, he took her hand even more firmly and said that if his damage resulted in her absolutization, he would gladly abdicate. When the girl heard this, she felt very pleased and thought that he was a worthy prince after all. But she still didn't understand if he should show his concern for his subordinates so openly, because others might not understand him. Any exemplary servant would have cracked his master on the nose if he suddenly decided to accept a wrong conclusion. But Adrian, smiling, said that it was indeed very favorable, could she say that. But she found the king more attractive than the prince, so she wondered if he would do it again when he became king. Ethan looked at her in surprise and then asked if she would really take him up on his offer. But the girl replied that she wouldn't do it anyway. She wants the rumors about it to be passed from generation to generation, and her dream is to become a charming grandmother with 10 grandchildren. She smiled happily and said that she couldn't agree more, that a grandmother who had almost become queen sounded much more impressive. But at that moment, the Duke turned to her and asked her to shut up at last, because it was impossible to openly express her disrespect towards the prince. However, Adrian thought about the fact that her vow to him did not include service in bed, so she owed him nothing. But at that moment, a guard suddenly came up to them, and after apologizing to the prince, said that it was time for them to go. After that, he grabbed the girl by the waist rather roughly and led her towards the exit, saying that they had a long way to go, so he said goodbye to everyone, wishing them good luck. Ethan, who had been standing still, began to watch all of this and thought about the fact that, in the end, the last thing he'd heard from her was that she dreamed of being a grandmother who almost became a queen. He looked at his dirty hand and thought also that she was gone, leaving behind only a musty odor on his palm, and that was very sad. And then, with a heavy sigh, he said that it had all happened exactly Adrian style anyway. It couldn't have happened any other way. That evening, when Della found herself alone with her assistant, she sipped her wine, and looking at her brother Adrian in surprise, wondered if Ethan had really proposed to her. The other guard, who had been standing next to them the whole time, said that this was indeed the case. He stopped her and said that the seat next to him was empty. When the girl heard about it, she was immediately very interested. She drank her guilt and said that it was rather unreasonable of him to do so. But then suddenly Kaylee looked at her and asked, "Wasn't this supposed to be a normal handshake? Why had they moved on to this kind of talk in that case?" Dela replied that his favorite little sister had received a proposal from the prince himself, and wondered if that was all he could say after that too. But at that moment the man suddenly became very serious and said that he had never thought of her as his sister. The princess, hearing this, of course, was not even surprised. She said that it was basically difficult to get along with siblings from noble families, so she understood his feelings perfectly. She also added that this is especially hard to do when they are so close to the throne. Kaylee also said that she is a child who by nature should not be allowed near him. But the princess, hearing this, was very surprised and said that she didn't really think so at all. She also added that even if this girl had grown up on the streets, she certainly wouldn't have gone unnoticed, because she has some talent of her own after all. The man was indignant and said that she thought too highly of this girl, and it was actually an honor for the Du family. He said the last words through his teeth, as he was really uncomfortable saying such a thing. But Dela, when she saw his feelings, suggested that he was in very deep turmoil. But this was quite expected, for his despised sister was now one with the heirs. In reality, Ethan didn't just make the offer to strengthen his claim. He never does anything at a loss. Then suddenly, one of the servants of the house said that he had heard that General Deflan on the Eastern Front was seriously ill. He has commandeered the white rocky plains of his estates, but he is too old to serve for long. Oh, Alphen is not so much a knight as a distinguished caretaker, more like someone who scavenges in front of his highness rather than fighting for his honor. The princess said he wasn't fit for the long local war ahead, not to mention the slum dogs. Then upon reflection, she said that a good doctor should just be sent to General Dauphin. On reflection, she also said she wondered how much it would even cost to send a person to Yogyakarta. Kelly, who was standing beside her, thoughtfully said that once upon a time, after all, she herself had dreamed of her. But the princess replied that the girl had been on her side then. She asked her assistant, if something couldn't belong to her, shouldn't it be destroyed without leaving a single trace? The man said nothing, but looked at her with a sad look. Then Dela replied that even such a despicable master must sometimes care for the welfare of his subordinates, and asked him if he was not the one who wanted it most. The man looked rather sad, and he didn't understand why he should even care in any way, for he had always disliked Adrian and thought she was superfluous in their family. So he said that considering that he already had one leg broken, it would be quite difficult for him to fulfill the role of a knight. When the princess heard this, she smiled happily and said that even without his leg, he would be able to play the role of her own hands perfectly and very faithfully fulfill that role. Kelly, immediately bowing, said that was rather generous praise on her part, and he was very grateful to her for it. And the girl, rising from her seat, said that in a place as dangerous as Yogyakarta, the death of an Aselica would look quite natural under any circumstances. If the regent died a violent death, it would be quite convenient to hold the other side responsible. Just walking down the street is enough to be killed by a resident of that country. The girl walked over and took down the huge cloth that was hanging on the ceiling, saying that it was rather strange that His Highness cared so much about this land. Dela also asked if he even knew that Adrian Du was originally planned to be used for other purposes. She said that although it was a remote mountainous area, the position of deputy agent was too high for her, and the prince who super-princessed and became the heir to the throne was also unmarried. Because of the method in which older men use unmarried girls as pawns, she almost became the ruler's consort instead of regent. It was surprising to the princess, however, that Struggle Du had begged for the post. The chancellor must have been a good father, since he defended his rights to the end. Well, Kelly didn't say anything to that. He just kept bowing to her and talking about how honored they were to have her praise their family like that. The girl, pouring herself another glass of wine, said that if Adrian had married, she wouldn't have had to die like this. But now she would be an unmarried corpse in dangerous terrain. She said the girl would be just another victim of circumstances that didn't work out in her favor. Soon, as night fell, they went to the stables to get a couple of horses and set out on their journey. Adrian looked at her partner and noticed that Nickel had been contentedly silent from the beginning, but had become even more closed off after he was jammed in. She had asked the maids to look after him as best they could, but apparently it didn't go as smoothly as she had expected. Suddenly she heard a familiar voice saying that he was unlikely to recover in such a short time. Adrian immediately turned her head to the side to see who was speaking, and when she looked toward the exit, she saw her father there. She was very surprised to see him, but the man came closer to her. He sighed heavily and said that she had lost after all, so she should stop supporting Prince Ethan because she no longer needed his protection, which he had failed to give her. When Adrian heard this, she was not at all surprised. She knew perfectly well that that was what her father would say to her. But then, after being silent for a while, she suddenly wondered in surprise if he really thought she had already lost. The man looked at his daughter in surprise and wondered if she thought she had won. But the girl replied in a cold voice that she had not yet. He looked at his daughter and wondered if she was eager to hold on to victory until the very end. Adrian smiled and replied that perseverance on the battlefield was the key to victory. So she certainly wasn't going to give up once she encountered the slightest difficulty. In fact, even from that white rocky plain, Adrian came back with a victory. So it is correct to say that she has not lost yet. However, her father wasn't sure if she could even come back and win one more time under harsher conditions. At that moment, he took his weapon from his belt and unclipped it, and then handed it to his daughter. She looked at him in surprise for a while, and then asked if it was for her. Adrian immediately recognized the sacred sword of the Dew family. It was now in her hands. The man said that Kelly did not know how to handle the sword properly. Alone, someone she could definitely do it for, and that's why he decided to give it to the girl. After all, it would do a lot more good that way. Adrian hesitated for a while, but she pulled it out of its case and saw the inscription. It said that the last survivor wins. Then she looked at her father in surprise and asked him if he had any regrets about taking her in. Then the man asked, in turn, what was the point of regretting what had already been done? White School smiled and replied that her father's tactless reply was something that hurt her son's feelings, and she was still really very grateful to him for sheltering her back then. But then suddenly she looked at him with a stern look and said that under all circumstances, she still couldn't accept Kaylee. The man sighed heavily and said that, of course, he understood it all perfectly well. She had her reasons, and he did not blame her for it. But still, the girl realized that he had no regrets about giving her that sword. That's what it means to be a real father. Before leaving, the man also said that Prince Ethan would not come for her even if the whole world collapsed. But at that moment, Adrian, smiling, said that even if not everyone else but father, she knew for sure that if Prince Ethan went that far, she would still run away. The man at this moment thought about the fact that he had been praying the whole time he knew this, and if people realized that the Chancellor was able to read the king's mind, he would simply be kicked out for being presumptuous. For the first time in his life, for his daughter's sake, he went to such great peril and offered the king another way. So the man turned to Adrian and said that she was not the sweet and obedient daughter that many fathers dream of, the one they brag about, saying that she would grow up to marry her father. She suddenly looked at him in surprise and asked if he was uncomfortable hearing such a thing now. The man said that she was the one who didn't even stutter or pay attention to words. And when he looked at how other fathers treat their adult daughters, he is very kind to her, and he can see it perfectly now. Adrian said that he cherished her so much that she had willy-nilly even begun to think of herself as Acella's best bride. for even Prince Ethan had proposed to her. When the man heard these words, he immediately became completely displeased and said that this fool certainly didn't understand anything. The girl then suddenly smiled and asked if he wasn't the one who had first praised him for having such a sharp and sound mind. But her father replied that any guy who proposes to his daughter will always seem not good enough for her father, so she shouldn't take his words so much to heart. Then Adrian laughed heartily and said that it was indeed a good joke. The man only continued to look at her with a serious expression. He thought about the fact that this might be the last time he would see this happy and innocent face in this life. So, becoming more serious, he said in a gruff voice that Princess Della would by no means leave her alone until she had gotten her way. Adrian, still smiling, replied that even she was thrilled at the possibility of taking her own life, and she certainly wasn't going to give her that pleasure. But then suddenly her father asked that she look into Bivan al-Murko, where he had gone long ago to conquer Yogyakarta. After being silent for a while, the man said that among the forgotten eyes he himself had once dreamed of a golden city. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised and asked if it was really true and he had truly seen everything. He said, reflecting on the past, that her father had actually been young and inexperienced once too. She walked over to the horse, and as she climbed up, she said that now she too had to look for what the very inexperienced young man was looking for. The man said it was right, so he wants her to come back and make her father happy with these findings. She looked at him in surprise, but after that, she still ran closer to the horse and, climbing on it, set off on a journey that was full of various dangers, but adventures too. The man went out into the courtyard to give his daughter a glance. It was hard for him to say goodbye to her, for he knew that this adventure would probably not end well. He didn't understand how he could watch with his own eyes as his own daughter left him for the most horrible place he could think of. At that moment, he immediately remembered how his wife had been in agony and dying. It was too painful for him, just like saying goodbye to his daughter now. He thought about the fact that maybe offering it was really the wrong decision. He needed to think of something else. Sir Alfin would probably freak out at how clumsy and stupid she was riding a horse, but still, she had no choice. The girl galloped with all her speed and thought about the fact that her father was still watching. She thought it all made no sense. She was sitting on an animal with a sword and reins. She didn't want to look back and realize that she shouldn't cry over such a small thing. After all, she'd been through worse. A knight shouldn't shed tears over some nonsense. However, she couldn't help herself, and eventually, Adrian cried without holding back her emotions. Soon, she and her slave were on their way. She looked up at the stars and thought it was all too hard, even for her. So for a while she just stood there looking at the stars. But now a month and a half had passed, and they had reached their destination. As soon as they were in the middle of the day in a contentedly warm and humid area, the girl got off her horse and walked over to the statue and began cursing her older brother. She couldn't stay on her feet because the road was too long and heavy, so she turned toward the man as she fell to the ground. Breathing heavily for air, she took off her boots and said she was so tempted to strangle her horrible brother. All because he had hurt her leg, and because of that, the road was much more difficult than the girl had anticipated. It was giving her a lot of trouble. It had been a month and a half since they had traveled the central road. As a criminal, she wasn't supposed to ride in a wagon with her head held high. So they stopped often along the way to take at least a short break and also to wait out the bad weather conditions. Then suddenly a horse came up to the girl, who was sitting on the ground and taking a break, and began to eat her green hair. She laughed a little and said that he was without a doubt the war horse of the family. At that moment a servant came up to her and immediately took her leg. However, Adrian managed to snatch it from him in time and asked him not to hit him in any way, for he was not her slave. She was actually very outraged by this behavior and said that she'd rather carry him on her back right now, and he was allowing himself to do this in the first place. In fact, usually if a soldier was wounded, he would be fully healed first before being shipped out. She thought she would rest for 10 days before leaving for such a long journey. But of course, she wasn't given much time. She had only 3 days to pack all her things and set out on her journey. Some say that the lady called the young gentleman lame, wished that his whole body was inflamed, and that he was a true colleague. And when the maid told the girl about it, she only indignantly replied that she had heard all about it. Adrian sighed heavily and said that in any case, that weirdo only thought of himself, so there was nothing to even count on any normal and human conditions. When the guy didn't answer anything to that, she turned to Nihil and asked that he stop being silent. She didn't care at all about the branding in his mouth, so he could speak completely freely. She also added that if he wanted to sit down, he just needed to stretch out his legs. She asked him not to be shy and to feel like a human being, not a servant. She was silent for a while, and then she said that it was all rather strange, but she did not continue the sentence. Then the man immediately asked what was strange. Adrian, when she heard him finally say a few words, was very surprised. In fact, Nihil had become less talkative to her after the branding had burned his tongue, and she'd already thought he'd lost the ability to talk altogether. Since he had been sold as a child, he probably didn't know much about the legend of the Golden City. As for her sentence, he probably only vaguely guessed that it was something utterly absurd. Then she pointed up at the statue near where they were lying and said that, strangely, it was this particular statue of the viral clan that was looking for the Golden City. In fact, Yogyakarta has had a legend about it since ancient times, the story of an incredible golden land. It is said that black water comes from there, which ignites even fire. For some time, many nations wished to control the flow of this black water, and so they sought out this very city. The statue of the people of Veril seeking this place was in many cities of the empire. Then she looked at the man and said that after the last conquest of Exile, most of them had probably been destroyed or just plain destroyed, but in this place, this statue still remained. Then she looked at the surprised expression on his face. He didn't understand anything at all, so she said he probably didn't know what she was talking about. Therefore, the girl pointed upwards, saying that this story was assuming the divine status of heavenly god, a filler. According to their legend, the first person who reached the Golden City and told people about it had wings. When the man heard this, he was very surprised. At that moment, he began to stretch his legs forward to be more comfortable and asked if he really had wings. After all, he had never heard of such a thing before. Adrian said that this was absolutely correct and then asked him where they were going. The man replied that, of course, they were going to Yogyakarta. The girl immediately said that the royal family of this city were the viral people, and asked if he knew how to distinguish their clan from the other inhabitants of this country. Of course, the man didn't know, and at that moment, some stranger came up to them and told them that the distinguishing characteristic they had was wings. Adrian immediately looked away in surprise and asked who said that, and then wondered with a smile on her face who was depriving her of any fun at all. And at that moment, she saw in front of her a blue-eyed big man who was dressed in the national costume of that region. They stared at each other for a while. Then she realized that Nihil was about to pull out a weapon to defend himself, but she used one hand to indicate to him not to do anything of the sort. The unfamiliar man leaned closer to her at that moment and bowed in respect. The girl immediately smelled resin from him. It wasn't actually the smell that bullies usually smelled. It was the smell that martial artists use to keep their swords in their hands. And at this moment, Adrian immediately realized that the same scent was coming from this stranger. In addition, this is also Asla's method, so she wondered in a flirtatious voice if it was the handsome villain who approached them. The man immediately smiled and thanked her for the compliment. He apologized for interfering when he heard them talking about the Golden Land. The girl immediately leaned against the monument and wondered if he was really that much interested, and added with a sneer in her voice that this was the kind of story that even children knew. But then suddenly the man said that her story was quite fascinating. However, there was something dangerous in it. Adrian was immediately interested and asked what was so dangerous in it that he even interfered in a complete stranger's conversation. The man said that the one with red wings would rediscover the golden land and become the king of men. So the people of Yogyakarta honored the winged people as dragons themselves. Hopefully, they will be able to find this very golden city. In fact, the following was written in the sacred scripture about Falara. From white full ripening seeds were born white-skinned Assyrians. From the brown dry seed were the inhabitants of Yogyakarta. From the gray wet seed were the Laksi, and from the golden shining seed was born a king of men with red hair and white skin, who carried the flame and ruled over the people as ruler of Afilar. That's why the legend of the Golden Family had to be buried. According to it, the viral clan was considered the ruler of the people. In particular, the temple of Afilar enslaved those who told such a story. So his words of danger were justified. It was probably for the same reason that the two wings of the statue were broken. When Adrian heard all this, she became even more interested in this unknown man. She wondered what kind of view would appear if that smiling mask suddenly collapsed right in front of her eyes. So, smiling, she said that she was very sorry. After all, this man with red wings would belong to Asela. She did so, for she was a little curious to see his true reaction. But the man reacted completely calmly. He smiled and asked if she hadn't promised to bring her back to them unharmed. Adrian, smiling, thought of the fact that no doubt he would not delay. So she said that promising to bring her back if she married an Assyrian was not the same as letting her go in peace. The man rose to his feet and asked if the Assyrians were overconfident in assuming that the princess would break by sharing a bed with one of them. When she heard what he was talking about, she got to her feet and said that he wasn't talking about her, as if she were a complete stranger. But the man replied that he was simply paying his respects to the heiress. Nihil at that moment sensed some hostile notes, so he immediately began to touch the sword that Father Adrian had handed over. And the girl said that she had assumed that someone would meet them. However, she did not expect to see the crown prince himself. The man replied that the protracted war in Yogyakarta had claimed the lives of all worthy people, and asked if even a worthless person like him should not make an effort. In fact, Adrian was perfectly aware of who he was already. It was Celeste Liu. He was the unfortunate heir to that throne. In fact, long ago, Princess Islam, who climbed to the top of Mount Kayal for the succession ceremony, happened to meet a man from Asela. Love erupted between them, and soon a son was born. The man who claimed to be a member of Asela's royal lineage made a promise to return, but he disappeared. He never returned. Everyone thought that the princess had been tricked by an Assyrian swindler, but the girl who was destined to become queen was unable to inherit the throne and was left all alone with a small child in her arms. The throne passed to her distant relative Portugal. He, who had previously left Yogyakarta, returned to the capital of Karta and successfully ascended the throne. Inheritance was allowed even for those who were not direct descendants of the king. The most important thing was to belong to the viral clan. This man fell in love with Princess Ayla with her enchanting smile, and they had a little Princess Elmara, who inherited the same beautiful wings. However, Celeste had no such wings because he was a half-breed with Assyrian blood from that passerby. As the young Princess Elmara fluttered her tiny wings around the palace, everyone remembered the legend of the Golden City. No one doubted that it was she who would bring prosperity to their country and become queen for the people. It was therefore not at all surprising that the princess and Myra were adored by everyone. Only a year ago, however, the capital fell to the relentless invasions of Asela, and their king demanded the princess or Myra as a hostage. They talked about the fact that they still had an heir, namely the prince. And the princess and Myra hadn't gone through the succession ceremony either. And if the succession ceremony is not tied to bloodlines, then someone else can do it. Just like that, Princess Elmara was to spend 5 whole years in Asil and marry their man. It was a condition of her return to her homeland. And that is why, at that time, Yogyakarta was ruled by Celeste, the unfortunate heir to the throne who had failed to inherit direct blood from both sides of his parents. In fact, the king had originally planned to marry Adriana off to this man and send her to this country. That's what everyone said. Although the girl was nicknamed Rabid Dog, her position as the daughter of the Dew family was more or less suitable, so he almost became her real spouse.